It was a few weeks ago when President Zelensky was in Estonia. And when they met with our Prime Minister, they discussed the will to defend of Estonians, Ukrainians, the state of Ukraine, state of Estonia. And the will to defend is the same sentence that has been written here in my sweatshirt. A few hours later, President Zelensky addressed the Estonian parliament wearing the same sweatshirt. And the way he spun this message was that it's much more urgent to draw our focus to resolve the win. Because this is what determines the future of the transatlantic world. And this is what we want to talk about today. This is what we have compiled into a report. And this is something we feel will provide you enough food for thought to actually convince that getting to the victory is something that is affordable, doable, executable. And it's not only the grandiose words, but it's also almost 30 pages of different numbers, arguments, euros, percentages, days that will convince each other that this is the pathway that can actually lead to a victory. We all read news. It doesn't matter whether we look towards Europe, we look towards Middle East. The democracy is at peril. That's the fact of life. And this is what's at stake there, and this is where the leadership of Europeans and Americans are needed. And this is, I think, the reason why we're discussing this. The Ukrainian victory is the only thinkable, the only feasible outcome of that war. And that needs to be clear from the very beginning. It's a no-fail mission. If we fail, then it will be the open door policy for all the future despots, murderers, autocrats, everyone who think that they can suppress the freedom and the self-fulfillment right of the countries and the people around the world. This is the test that is ongoing there, and we can never forget it, even if we dig into the sort of frontline reports from the frontline cities. What is ongoing now is that Russia is convinced that they are winning. And they are convinced because they think that they can outproduce, outsuffer, outlast, out whatever. And they're trying to implant this idea into the heads of all the people living in the transatlantic atmosphere. Well, our job, frankly, is to do exactly the same. We need to convince them that whatever they think, whatever they take forward, they will lose. All the trend lines that their general staff is putting in their Excel spreadsheets will lead to zero at the end of the day. Well, the good news is that, again, it's not only slogans who are supporting this thesis. It's also numbers. Does anyone know what's the difference between the Ramstein coalition and Russian GDP? Well, just from the hip, I mean, what's the 30 times. So if Russians earn $1, then we match it with 30. That's a pretty big difference. The difference in defense expenditure is 13 times. And if we look into the wartime expenditure, then Russia is actually, and that's the fun fact, Russia is spending twice as much to war efforts than the Ramstein coalition does in a month. 11 billion versus around 5.5 billion a month. So this is where we are. And I'm not speaking about the access to capital, access to talent, access to new technologies, access to better supply chain, access to people who are willing to stand for that effort, to stand for good to win and bad to be suppressed. And this is what our report is about. We are at the territory of attrition war. This is something that is, I think, is a fact, well-established fact. Attrition warfare is not something that was invented now in 2024. This has been the common characteristics of, well, basically all the wars throughout the human history. And the way it's being characterized is through three axes: manpower, resources, and will. And this is what we tackle in our report. First, manpower. The calculation is extremely easy. In order to convince your opponent that you will win at the end of the day as a result of attrition war, you need to convince them that, well, you can kill more people than they can regenerate. It's a little bit cruel to say that, but that's the fact of life when you're at war. The current figures are that Russians are able to generate around 40,000 troops as trained in the units, trained soldiers in 6 months. Okay, they can recruit more, but everything that comes on top of that is a biomass. This is something that they just plug the gaps, and that's really like baby diapers that you use once and then throw away. What matters is this 40,000. If we look at the statistics, then Ukrainians throughout these last 2 wars have been already able to impose more attrition to them. They have been in position to kill more, damage more, impose more casualties. So this is something that needs to be sustained. Why? Because it convinces them that day by day, week by week, month by month, you will have lost more soldiers than you can regenerate. And this is something that implants this thought to their heads, that at the end of that road, well, you will end up with 0 people. And of course, if you put this thing on your graph, then it starts to convince you that maybe it's better to stop that cruelty. Second axis, and of course, we also spend pages and pages here on the better training and everything that needs to be taken on board day by day, where the laser focus needs to be there to adjust to what's ongoing on the battlefield. The second axis is resources. What's going on in Ukraine is the fire superiority war. And how do you regain fire superiority? Well, by having more ammunition, by shooting longer, by being able to destroy more artillery than they can regenerate. Well, the current figures are, and there have been a lot of complaints about that, how Europe has been low, how US has been slow and all that. And even for our appetite, the pace have been too slow and it has been too little. But at the same time, let's just look at the figures. In 21, the European manufacturing capability was around 300,000 shells a year. It was roughly the same in US. European Union will reach around 1 million manufacturing capability by the end of this quarter. This is tripling up in less than 3 years. By the end of this year, the figure will be around 1.3, 1.4. And if everything goes according to the plan, we get to around 2 million by the end of 25. And US is pretty much in the lockstep in the same efforts, which means that by early 25, Ukraine will be in position where he can impose attrition to Russians in the same parameters. Every single day, they will destroy more than Russians can impose on themselves. Yes, Russians might have more shells, but our shells are better. They shoot longer, they're more precise, they're more reliable, and it's doable. And now I get to the third axis, that is a willingness. That is mainly something that is all been converted to dollars and euros. We need to sustain the war effort. And what we have calculated here in this report is in order to achieve these results, you need to invest around 0.25% of GDP to war efforts. So this number is important in two ways. First, well, it serves the purpose. 0.25 is around 130 billion total for Ramstein coalition. The second point of 0.25 of GDP that now people calculate in their daily lives, in their households. But what it carries, 0.25 is a small figure. What time is it now? It's 9 o'clock? Okay, five more hours today, and we have done the part for this year. This is how small it is. 0.25, it's affordable, doable, something that everyone can afford. And this is the message. There have been efforts to depict this war as some sort of overhuman, Herculean task. Well, it isn't. It's a fairly simple task to do. So what's the alternative? Well, alternative is very, very bipolar here. Russia will win. So, and if this alternative is on the table, then we have two options. First, of course, is ramp up, provide more aid, and be more sustainable. And the other one is to give up. And now, if we say the second option, then, well, I suspect that half of this room, well, including myself at times, I mean, it's attrition war, is feeling a little bit embarrassed of the thought they had in their heads. And this is why I think Putin thinks that he can convince us that he will prevail. And this is something that we cannot let to happen. And this is why we need to have this resolve to win. So this is about the report now. But since I'm in the capital of the free world, then I have a second sheet of paper. And I speak a little bit about Europe, a little bit about US, a little bit how much interlinked we are. We have been asked very often recently that, well, what will happen with the transatlantic relations? What will happen with US-European defense relations once there might be the change in your administration? And what we always answer is that this is what the European and US relations is not about. Our relations are cemented into history, values, the common way of thinking, economy. This is something that cannot overruled, changed over a weekend. And I can give you some figures. And almost all of these figures actually come as a surprise to me as well. Europe is the biggest export market for US companies. As a matter of fact, 45 states have Europe as the biggest export destination. And it's by a factor of magnitude higher than vis-a-vis China. 65% of FDIs, total FDIs coming to US are coming from Europe. And you know how much it's in a year? 3.5 trillion. Trillion, this is the figure that I don't know how many zeros there are. That's a lot of money. And it's actually 2.7 times more than from Asia. US companies in Europe earned $350 billion of profits in 2022. That's also a lot of money. And it's also around 3 times more than US companies do from Asia. Then the main customer for US LNG is actually Europe. It's not China or someone else. 60% of this goes to Europe. 60% of European dollars, European euros are coming to US from that channel. And it goes on. The list is it's just a manifestation that our prosperity and safety is something that we achieve for together, that we work for, that we aspire for every single day. On Ukrainian war, it does not come as a surprise, of course, especially for people in this room. Every single dollar of this $70 billion that US have already provided aid to Ukraine does not leave the soil of US. It is directly going under contracts to 38 different states. And moreover, in the last 22 months, can anyone just, predict the figure? What's the total number of defense contracts that European governments have put forward to US defense companies in the last 2 years as a result of the war? 90 billion. That's a pretty healthy number. And moreover, does anyone know anyone in US who likes Iran? Anyone? I mean, you have more than 400 million people. There has to be one. Is there anyone who aligns their security interests with the values of North Korea? Well, probably not much. Is there anyone who would think that the pathway that China has chosen in the advancing of human rights, the freedom of law, is a right pathway to take? Is a pathway to prosperity and safety? Well, these three nations are the main supporters of Russia. This is how the world is being polarized. And again, if the true leadership, if the true guardians of the European or the transatlantic American values are needed, then the leadership of US and Europe is something that always have stood up in the last 70 years. And this is the moment when this is again needed. And this is the message we want to get through with this report. This is the litmus test. This is the truth that will be revealed eventually in Ukraine by uprooting the aggression as a tool. But it's just a plain notion that you just don't evade, occupy other countries. You just don't suppress the self-fulfillment right of people and countries in 2024. And if we fail at that, then we have much larger challenges in front of us than if we would fulfill this simple task of investing 0.25% of GDP every year for Ukrainian to win the war. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to discussions. I just wish that we don't make it an interview, so I'm very much interested in your thoughts, your perspectives. It's also a crucial time here in this town. So be open and let's hope for a good discussion. Thank you.
I promise not to make it an interview, but allow me to open with a question at least. Picking up where you left off, I'd like to share the framing of there being almost a block of revisionists, the North Koreans, the Iranians, the Chinese in economic and dual use terms, supporting the Russian war effort. And the flip side of that is that we as the West need to support the Ukrainians to counter the Russians and to support them. In the report, you list the number of 50,000 that need to be attrited every 6 months in Russian soldiers in order to put Ukraine on a positive trajectory. Mm-hmm. And for that, you list also a number of systems in which our defense industrial bases need to really perform. You've already referenced artillery from the podium. Both barrels and shells are listed in the report. Gimblers deserve and receive their own section.
Yeah. Air
defenses as well. Can you give us Americans a sense of how Europe is performing in some of these categories? Mm-hmm. Are you optimistic, pleased, content with the levels of production and where they're heading, or is there more work to be done? And what are the barriers to maybe improving our performance there?
Well, of course, the honest answer is that no. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't have these seminars. We would have a celebratory party how good we are. But that's not the case. So for our appetite, of course, it's too slow and too little. But things are moving forward. I think the understanding that Europe needs to take its act together, needs to attribute individual responsibility on the heads of state and government level, and each and every member state is getting home. We are close to that. Europe is taken forward steps that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. There is open debate about European defense bonds ongoing in Brussels and in most of European capitals. And we're fairly confident that some of this will materialize. On this defense industrial base argument that we make here, this is hugely relevant for Ukraine. I don't think that there's anyone who needs to be convinced on that. But likewise, this is hugely relevant also for Taiwan, hugely relevant for Middle East, hugely relevant for whatever crisis risk scenario ahead of us. So basically, we need to do it anyway. And the good thing with that, and I think this is something that we started to realize, I think early 23, that it's not enough to only speak about threat. I mean, it's more than sufficient to speak about it in Estonia, for example, because it's very close to our skins. But we need to be much more cleverer in advancing that story in US, for example, in many European capitals. And this is where this industrial base comes into play. We need to associate defense with jobs, investments, growth, technology, everything that makes it attractive for politicians and people and makes you vote for that. That spills over the technologies that open up new businesses, open up new ventures, open up new business categories. And this is that makes all the other sectors vibrant. And there is so much ongoing in Ukraine in the technological front that it will definitely determine the future of the battlefields, but also the future of the defense industrial base, both in US and Europe. And I mean, if you're working in that sphere, then this is good times. This is something that you want to associate yourself with. This is something, if you're in an undergraduate school, you want to associate your career with. And that's a sort of mental shift that is happening that wasn't commonplace maybe just 5 years ago. And this is how we sort of build our success and build the future prosperity and build the future safety.
Yeah, I would say my generation, I'm 40, came of age in post 9/11.
Congratulations.
Thanks. Well, I'm about to turn 41, so my 40th year is nearly past. But the point being, my generation was formed by the experiences of 9/11, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And so many of my cohort from graduate school wanted to learn counterinsurgency and speak Arabic. And I think there's a deficit of Kremlin watchers, Russian speakers, Russian area specialists. And you feel that a little bit in the Washington community. There's a gray-bearded class of experts who made their bones studying the Soviet Union. Then there's a gap. But now, to your point, there are undergraduates who are beginning to really read into Russian history. Picking up on the defense industrial base issue, one category that's also in here, which I did not mention, is the UAV front. And here, NATO focuses a lot on emergent disruptive technologies. Two lessons I've taken from the conflict when it pertains to UAVs is that they cannot substitute necessarily for artillery, but the Ukrainians are attempting to overcome some of their shell hunger with UAVs. And then secondly, that there is basically a complete and total ISR blanket over the front lines at this point because UAVs have just made it very difficult. You could never launch an Ardennes-style offensive like the Germans did during World War II. What are some of the thoughts swirling in your mind when you see, began of course in Nagorno-Karabakh, where UAVs really made their appearance on the battlefield in a major way for the first time in the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. But really, the transformational lessons I think are being drawn now in Ukraine. Do you agree with that? And what do you think about when you hear the acronym UAV?
First of all, on the generations, I think we are collectively hugely lucky that this conflict happened in 2022. If it would have happened 5 years after, then there would have been 0 generals leading the US military, European militaries, who breastfeeded the conventional defense. It would have all been humanitarian aid, out-of-area operations, all that. But the current breed of generals, including General Cavoli in Europe, is someone who has in his muscle memory how to do this forward defense, how to fight Russians. This is why they assume to the service. And we are, I think, extremely lucky that they can use this. What is with repetitive actions is something that they still know by heart. And this is also true in Europe. It's the last generation or last year groups of generals who still have this. Well, UAVs is a huge topic. It will definitely determine the future battlefields. It is definitely challenging the cost-to-target ratio elements. It is definitely putting a different headline to the requirements of all the NATO member states, when previously it was high price, high performance, that now it's basically good enough. And this is something that is happening in Ukraine. This is potentially something that will change the landscape of defense industrial base. This is something that makes it much more attractive, much more agile for emerging companies to enter this market rather than the behemoths of the last 50 years. I think also that we shouldn't draw the sort of ultimate conclusions from the FB videos that we all see from Twitter. The fact of the matter is that the FPVs are used because there's shell hunger. And no matter how innovative you are, you cannot surpass the basic physics. The 155 is good because it will carry 30 kilos of explosive to up to 40 kilometers with a pretty good accuracy. Trying to do the same thing with the UAVs is, I think currently it's still much more expensive. We are, I think, approaching to this cost to target ratio that will make it much more attractive in years, especially with the environment of better surveillance, intelligence, and target acquisition. But I think the sort of old disciplines of artillery warfare is going nowhere.
Yeah, I like to say that Ukraine has had 4 major offensives since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The battle for Kyiv, which Ukraine won. The battle for Kharkiv, which Ukraine won. The battle for Kherson, which Ukraine won. And then the counteroffensive, which was less than successful. I wouldn't say that Russia won, but Ukraine did not achieve some of its strategic objectives on land, even though it was rather successful in the Black Sea, opening up the corridor. And one lesson I've taken away from the land counteroffensive is that we might have set too high of expectations for what Ukraine could absorb in short training windows. And maybe I could just quote from your report briefly, because a good moderator always advertises the product that's being displayed. Again, for those of you at home, it's called Setting Transatlantic Defense Up for Success. On page 12, you and your team write, this is, during the Second World War, British infantry would receive over 20 weeks of training before they were considered basically proficient, and the US Army operated with 13 to 17 weeks of basic training. The training set up to train entire brigades for the Ukraine counteroffensive was about 5 weeks, as you also note in this report. How should we think about training going forward? It's a bit of a leading question that obviously 5 weeks is not enough, but what lessons did you take away from the counteroffensive on the training side?
Well, first of all, I love your enthusiasm. I mean, if Ukrainian is winning all the battles, then how come they're still having 20% of their territory occupied? It's a war. It's a terrible war where Ukrainians are playing with the cards that have been dealt to them. All these cards are not jacks. They are tens. They are also twos and threes. The training remains a big requirement, especially the operational trainings, battalion level and up. It's a ongoing pressing requirement to take on board all the lessons from the battlefield day to day, week by week. I think we collectively struggle with that. Also, I can confess in Estonia, we struggle with taking on board the lessons from Ukraine. It's difficult. It's very difficult. It's difficult to analyze, difficult to implement. And you might imagine if it's difficult in Estonia in the deep peacetime, then it needs to be much more difficult in Ukraine. Well, clearly, this fact of it's difficult, this is not a source of solace or something. We need to upkeep these training efforts. And if we look at the training efforts that the West has collectively put forward, these numbers are actually quite encouraging. In total, the US efforts, the European Union, EU MEM mission, US or the UK Interflex, has in total trained 100,000 soldiers with a price tag of 350 million. That makes the 3,500 a soldier, together with equipment. That's a pretty good deal, I have to say. It's a pretty good return on investment. And I think this is the fact that we need to amplify and just keep on investing and keep on taking all these lessons on board. It's a difficult warfare, and there are insufficient supply basically in all the categories of warfare. So this is something that we sometimes forget to discount if we do our plans.
Perhaps one last comment / question, and then if there are comments or questions from the audience, we'll go there. One area also discussed in this report is the issue of sanctions, which might be a little bit outside of your remit, but honing in on the defense element of sanctions. You raised from the podium the vast superiority of the Ramstein contact group, the defense contact groups, economic size vis-a-vis Russia, $47 trillion, I think, is the total sum, aggregate sum of what the Ramstein group offers, with all of the advanced technologies that Russia also needs to be able to run its war against Ukraine. Do you think that, in your mind, sanctions need to be adjusted, or is it more a matter of enforcement of existing sanctions on the book to keep some of these technologies out of Russian hands?
Of course, there needs to be more sanctions. Russia needs to get the message that they will end up in ruins. They will end up broke after this war efforts. This needs to be part of the strategy. Again, the track record of sanctions have not been perfect. As a matter, it's actually a fact. None of the sanctions from the Crimean War, in 2014, have been lifted. They have adjusted to that. They learn how to live with sanctions. And they have mastered this art of being criminals as a whole nation, basically. So we need to keep on running, keep on pressing, keep on making this as a separate KPI for attrition warfare. And it clearly needs efforts from all of us. And I think this is the ultimate question where the truth is revealed. It's easy to make policy proposals when you're only using to spare money. Where it gets difficult is where you need to make policy decisions at the expense of your own healthcare, your own infrastructure, your own education system. And I don't think that neither Europe nor US is on that territory yet. But this is where the true leadership is being revealed. And this is where I think everyone will get eventually. Hopefully it will be sooner than later. But the problem attribution is getting there. And it's getting there on the individual level of heads of state and government. And if you're a prime minister, if you're a president, if you're a politician, then the two parameters of your life, or two KPIs, are basically elections that are upcoming everywhere all the time, and legacy. And what legacy means in these times is fairly simple. Do you want your name and your picture in the history books with a sentence that you were in office when the Transatlantic security was diluted or it was sold off? And there are a single prime minister or president who wants to associate themselves with that theme. And once we get there, I think great things start to happen. True leadership is never being revealed when you need to step on pedestals. True leadership is revealed when you are alone in the room, whole world against you, and you need to pick between right or wrong. And we're approaching that moment, and Europe, US has a terrific track record in always making the right decision when the things get hard.
And just to put a finer point on that, you really only get one or two lines in history, I think, as an administration in the United States. And if the Biden administration is already tagged with the rather unfortunate, I'd even say feckless withdrawal from Afghanistan, and subsequently now also the war in Gaza, this would be an opportunity for them to really put a positive point on the board and have a lasting legacy of delivering for Ukraine. With that, we'll go to the audience. Ian Brzezinski has an opening point / question, and I think I'll just bring the microphone to him, and we'll go from there.
When you think about NATO, $47 billion in GDP, Russia, $1.5, $1.8 billion in GDP, spending, NATO is $1.2 trillion. Russia has an official defense budget of $88 billion, $120 billion in terms. To me, the fact that the alliance isn't really enabling Ukraine to just crush the Russians with this disproportionate level of advantage is a reflection of political will. And one of the impediments to our ability to exercise political will has been the West's estimation of the risk of escalation in this conflict. And I wonder, do you agree with the assertion that the alliance, particularly community here in Washington, has overestimated the risk of escalation and underestimated the realms of action that could be taken to enable Ukraine to win decisively and quickly on the battlefield?
Well, in retrospective, if it's of course truth. I mean, every single red line that Russians have set have been crossed and nothing has happened. Ukraine is opening up new fronts deep inside Russia almost daily. It hasn't led into the escalation to anywhere else. So I think the lessons learned is that we need to do exactly the same things that we put forward in the report. We need to equip them with better soldiers, better weapons, more effective weapons to convince them that at the end of the road, Russians will lose. And we don't really need to only determine the success by these contagious sort of elements of weapons. There are also a lot of other stuff that is extremely helpful in getting to that cause. All the simple anti-tank mines, artillery, long-range fires in other sectors rather than the ATACMS. We just need to keep on going and ignore all these self-imposed restrictions.
I'll just
But
add.
what do you think?
I think we have underestimated the realm of action that can be taken. For example, I think it's stunning that NATO isn't more involved in supporting Ukraine directly as an institution. That itself sends a powerful signal, not just to the Ukrainians, which is the wrong signal, but also the wrong signal to the Russians. I think until the West demonstrates that it has the political will to fight the Russians, Putin's going to be motivated to sustain this. So you can't deter effectively if you don't demonstrate the will to fight. And that's what concerns me about the West strategy, transatlantic strategy of support to Ukraine.
I would just add to that, I think it also sends a signal beyond Europe. If third countries conclude that the US can be pushed off of its line because of nuclear saber rattling, then the attractiveness of pursuing one's own nuclear weapons program, I think, increases dramatically. And as a side note, I think, I don't think the Iranians have paid an all too high cost for their own rush to a nuclear weapon, which also suggests that the pain for trying to get one might not be all that large. So Americans, going back to the days of the Kennedy administration, have worried about a nuclear proliferation cascade. So perhaps this is just part of our mode of thinking, but I don't think that we're de-incentivizing the pursuit of weapons of mass destruction. Ian wants to come in with one.
Just push on this, the classic impact of escalation fear in this conflict has been the West's or the Atlantic community's refusal to really move decisively on Ukraine's ambition to join NATO. And I was struck in your report, if I could find one area where I would criticize it, where I wish it had done more, is to take that issue on. Shouldn't bringing Ukraine into NATO be part of the win strategy instead of the post-war strategy to sustain peace?
Well, clearly the answer is yes. If we want prosperous, safe Europe, then it needs to be an environment where every single nation can choose their own pathway, can choose their own alliances. There can be no dictator outside telling nations where you can belong or where you cannot belong to. And as long as we accept this attitude, we are in the negative territory. That's plain fact. Ukraine needs to be in a position where they can choose their own destiny. And the destiny in Europe, in the transatlantic world, in the last 75 years have been in NATO. Economically, it has been in the European Union. And this is something that needs to be at the end of the road for them, because this is the ultimate guarantee. This is what they are fighting for. This is how they have determined their destiny. This is how they have committed to these values. And this is not only declarations or some bills they're paying. This is the ultimate sacrifice that you can do for your own destiny. So I don't think that there is any discounts that we can do on that front. Okay, we can discuss what is exactly the date or or whatever other parameters, but at the end of the road, there needs to be full membership. I mean, that's clear.
Great, thank you. Secretary Steve Flanagan from Rand and Georgetown University. I wanted to draw you out a little bit on your, first of all, congratulations on truly a detailed and impressive report. I wanted to draw you out a bit more on your ministry's relative net assessment of Ukrainian and Russian force generation capabilities. You noted in your remarks earlier in the report about the capacity that would be needed to really diminish effectively Russian force generation capabilities, and particularly the highly trained, that cadre that you noted that they would need every 6 months to really be effective in holding their current positions and perhaps gaining additional advances. Well, what about the Ukrainian force generation? It seems this has been a story that has been bubbling up now more and more, especially with evidently the position that General Zaluzhny took in calling for wider mobilization to achieve up to about 500,000, if reports are correct. Whether that's sustainable with the Ukrainians really can generate that kind of force. And then also, what about capacity to train a matching cadre? Would they have to do 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 to be able to undertake any kind of offensive operations against the Russians? So I just want to, particularly in those contested areas, just want to draw you a bit more on your calling for prolonged war of attrition. This is one of the key things. There's been a lot of focus on all the equipment. That's one factor, but personnel and will to fight is the other major factor in this. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very serious perspective. I think the way I'm thinking of it right now is that how are Russians thinking of the attrition warfare? Do they have a similar strategy? What are their KPIs? And I would imagine that there are 2 key determinators in their heads, what they need to influence to get to their results. And the first, of course, is the Western aid. They need to diminish it. They need to make a case that it's all useless, it's all spent, it's all whatever. And we have read it from the papers here and there. This is a very powerful narrative they spill over the world. And the second one is the same manpower element, the same mobilization argument. There is no way that Ukraine can win this protracted attrition warfare without mobilization. That's a fact. So our job in this journey is to encourage and facilitate to do the right thing. Not to make a fuss or not to make a political problem out of their internal whatever issues, but to inject trust, transparency, something that will lead them to do the difficult but right decisions. There haven't been much facts about the Ukrainian force generation, the ratios, so I don't really want to go there because I don't want to present opinions on facts, but they're also struggling. And these numbers that have been publicly put forward, up to 500,000 for a couple of years, that's a lot of people. What they haven't done, they haven't really tapped into the generation below 30. I think the average frontline age is above 40 now. So it tells 2 stories. One story is that the warfare is grim, ugly, horrendous, but it also tells the story that there is unused potential. Something that will inject hope to the same strategy that Ukraine can easily win the war. Well, not easily. We can never use that adjective here, but there is pathway that can be executed.
Michael?
Hi, Michael Dachana, Yorktown Institute. You mentioned the strikes and raids and covert operations the Ukrainians have been pulling off in Russian territory. 2-part question on this. One, what do you think the long-term operational, tactical, morale benefit of these will be? And 2, it's no open secret that there are some in the Biden administration who hate that the Ukrainians keep doing this, evidently against direct advisement. If you think there's value to these, how do Ukraine's European NATO allies advocate for the use of these attacks to skeptics in Washington?
Well, the art of the warfare is imposing the strategic dilemmas to your opponent. And this is what Russia does every day, and they do it extremely successfully. And they're extremely successful in finding the very high return on investment areas in doing that, in just occupying the bandwidth of our leadership time to deal with things that are imposed by Russia but are totally unrelated with the warfare. They are doing this every day with, well, immigration also, very relevant topic here. They do it also in Europe. They have spread the confusion in Latin America, in Africa. And the reason they're doing this is because they know that if they can associate Russian actions around the world with Ukrainian war somehow, then you create a calculation for the West to say that, okay, if the Ukrainian war will end, then maybe also the inflation will end, maybe the world hunger will end, maybe the energy crisis will end, and so forth. Of course, these things are totally unrelated because they're all caused by Russia. But this is the strategy they're executing, and I think it would be extremely dishonest not to allow the same thing for Ukraine, especially if they're doing it on the soil of the murderous country. They need to impose the same strategic dilemmas. That the warfare is not only something that the departments in the Ministry of Defense are dealing with, but it needs to be something that's also associated with other areas of life in Russia, including economic life. If the economic life is not hurt by the warfare, then the likelihood that war will end soon is just the prolonged perspective.
I would just add, Ukraine as the smaller country can hardly afford to allow Russian troops to sunbathe on their side of the border and come across at will. Even the US military, the biggest, strongest, most impressive fighting force in the world, struggled in Afghanistan with safe havens in Pakistan, struggled in Iraq with rat lines from Iran and Syria, struggled in Vietnam with forces coming in from across the border, Cambodia, Laos, et cetera. And so I think it's hardly fair to demand of the Ukrainians that they fight with one arm tied behind their back. Are there any more questions? All right.
Or perspectives from your side.
He'll have a perspective, I'm sure, Alexander.
Word of much for this visit, for this conversation to Hudson, to the embassy, to the job, and we really appreciate that Estonian people standing with us really together, and one more proof that when we are calculating and speaking about numbers, Estonia always the first according to GDP and assistance to Ukraine. Thank you for emphasizing NATO question. It is substantial, it's critical. Our victory is essential for Europe, essential for the United States, for the US leadership, and of course, your words is like words of hope, but not only words, but practical elements of the plan. Thank you for this plan, and of course, defeating Russia, it's a great challenge, but at least we should start from the certain elements. We see very positive this report and these elements that we're working hardly on a daily basis. We're using your report with colleagues to work here in a special targeted audiences. And again, thank you. We think that we need more engagement on this topic, and really appreciate to feel the support of our Baltic friends, our US colleagues, and friends in Europe on a daily basis. It is so crucial and is so important and vital for us. Thank you once more again, and thank you, Hudson.
And thank you. You are carrying the burden for all of us.
Deb
So
has a question.
any other perspectives on the report or the whole prospect of Ukraine winning the war? So what is the sort of main criticism against that? I mean, that is, I guess, something that we want to hear the most.
Deb, you're not allowed to ask a question. You have to offer a perspective now. Here you are.
It's a question. Thank you so much, sir. Really good discussion, great report. Deborah Kagan with the Atlantic Council. I just wanted next week, we have a contact group meeting in Brussels and followed by the Defense Ministerial. And they're expecting about another 50 countries to come to the contact group meeting. There's been a lot of hand-wringing in certain parts of NATO and in the West that we are emptying out our stocks for Ukraine. The question I have is a little more fundamental. And my question is, it's almost flippant, which is, what the heck else are you going to do with your stocks? If Ukraine uses this equipment now to win this war now, this is a problem you don't have to face later. So the heart of the question is, there are a number of countries in NATO who are nowhere near the front lines with anyone, who have their ports stuffed with enough US vessels to have their own armada. And they still are holding on to things like Patriots and other things that we know they're never going to use. They're not, I mean, there are some countries that have Patriots and I feel like, what are you going to do? Go after your Austrian neighbors or something like that? So the question is, how do you convince these other countries that you can start putting these things forward? You're not going to use them because there's no threat against you right now. And you can start sending this forward. And how do you make them convinced of doing this, especially during this crucial time when the US is, excuse my language, screwing itself over on the Hill on this and not coming up with this? What is going to take for the Europeans to really stand up and say, okay, we understand you have this political issue, democracies are not safe. How do you then say, in the interim, what we're going to do is send these newer weapons we have to Ukraine, and then you can backfill them later once you have your funding. How do you convince them to do this now? And I think you know the countries I'm talking about.
That's a good question. Well, the strategy that we have chosen is not to insult our allies, not to put them on the spot. What we rather try to do is to inspire them to build a case that caters them their interests. Primarily, we have chosen to do it by showing example. Already in January 22, we sent in javelins. We had a lot of questions from media, from domestic players. So why are you doing this? What's the purpose? It's escalating, all that. Our answer was very simple. The sole purpose of buying javelins was shooting Russian tanks. And this is why we sent them there. We chose to send out our howitzers already in January, a month before the war. We had a lot of criticism. And the reason was the same. If we all want to prevent the war, then the words are clearly not enough. We need to send weapons. There was a debate for a few months, or a few weeks, but it ended up with, well, now all the European nations sending in lethal weapons. At the end of 22, we formed the so-called Tallinn Pledge, where 11 nations. It was a similar time of warfare where the room was pretty dark, the perspective was pretty grim. We chose to send out all our towed howitzers. And the message with that was very simple. Well, first of all, Ukraine needed it. We needed to send it. But the second one was exactly the point you made. If Estonia can afford to take the risk in the front, being exposed to the biggest risk, and being in the geographic location where it's the most difficult to guard the NATO territory, then there are 0 nations in the alliance who would have the excuse that we cannot send them because we are exposed to some sort of risk. The third thing, and this is what our Prime Minister is doing, we try to speak about the honest words about our risks. If we speak about diluted stocks, the inability to manufacture, the uncompetitiveness of our industrial base, and these are all like back office terms for lieutenant colonels. Something that your immediate thought in your head is that, well, I don't know, do something about it. Fill your Excel sheets, make a meeting. But what it actually means is that if you lack stocks in your inventories, then you're unable to defend your country. That is the truth. That is the actual consequence of that. And we hesitate to use these words, Why? Because it dilutes the political responsibility. There are a lot of prime ministers who want to speak about the insufficient supplies and whatever, but I think there would be zero prime ministers who would proudly stand out and say that we are unable to defend our country. And if we get the problem attribution there, then things start to change.
Well, NATO came up twice, and Ian raising it is really appropriate because he's been one of the strongest and most eloquent defenders of an advocate for Ukraine's entry into NATO. I would also urge our viewers to check out my colleague Luke Coffey's testimony in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
That's a great one.
Last week. Great, you've already seen it. I'll preview also, I have an essay coming out with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation hooked to the 75th anniversary of the Washington Treaty in April on the same topic. But we were here today, not for those, but instead for this, setting transatlantic defense up for success, a military strategy for Ukraine's victory and Russia's defeat. I urge you all to read it. Again, it'll be posted underneath the event link at hudson.org. If you're there right now, check it out. If you're watching this on YouTube or another channel, navigate there, or I'm sure it's on the Estonian Ministry of Defense or Embassy website. Thank you so much for allowing us to partner with you today. I hope you've had a wonderful time in Washington, and look forward to another Hudson Embassy of Estonia event sometime in the near future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.